I'm Elizabeth Kassler-Taub. I'm one of the postdoctoral fellows this year. I'm excited to introduce you to the final session of our symposium, The Resistance of the Vernacular. We have two great speakers this afternoon. We're going to start out with our first, once everyone takes their seats. So our first speaker is Conrad Thake. He is an architect, urban planner, and architectural historian. He is currently associate professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Malta. Dr. Thake received a BA in architecture and civil engineering from the University of Malta, an MA in planning from the University of Waterloo in Canada, and a PhD in architecture from the University of California at Berkeley. So we're welcoming him back to California. He co-authored 2 volumes on Malta with the late Quentin Hughes, Malta, the Baroque Island in 2003, and Malta, War and Peace, an Architectural Chronicle, 1800 to 2000, published in 2005. He has published several books, including The Ottoman Muslim Cemetery in Malta and Contemporary Architecture in Malta, just to name 2. And his contributions have featured in several international journals, including Lexicon, Mukarnas, and Palladio. Dr. Thake is a Salzburg Fellow and a member of CICA, the International Committee of Architectural Critics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thake.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'd like to thank the directors and associates of the Institute for inviting me over to come here after an absence of 24 years from California. I think my talk will come with a bit of a health warning, because I've decided, maybe recklessly, to dispense with notions of time. So I'm trying to compress 5 millennia in 35 minutes. But I did put one constraint on myself. So spatially, it's all confined to Malta, this Mediterranean island, small island. I don't know if you're familiar with Malta. Actually, the main island of Gozo, Malta, and Gozo and Comino, relatively uninhabited, population of around 450,000, with a very long history. And we've been occupied by various foreign powers. So what I'm hoping to do is I've rather focused on various thematics of monumentality throughout time, from antiquity all the time to modernity. That sounds very ambitious, but I hope to provoke, at least a good base for discussion, and that you will be, in a way, inspired by some of the aspects that have, in a way, molded the landscape of Malta. Malta is a small island state, geographically situated at the center of the Mediterranean and the cultural crossroads between Southern Europe and North Africa. The island is home to some of the oldest freestanding human-made structures, the Megalithic Temples complexes of Hajar-Im and Imnidra. We're seeing the one in Imnidra, and Jganti and Gozo, that date to some 5,000 years ago, even older than Stonehenge. The temples were constructed on strategically prominent sites and were intended as sacred places for homage to some cosmic deity. They were planned and designed with specific reference to a landscape context that symbiotically connected land, sea, and the celestial cosmos beyond. Physical size is also a relevant factor when one considers the massive dimensions of some of the constituent elements, which is the natural limestone out of which they were built, and the various engineering challenges posed by the sheer mass of these temple complexes. Here you could see one of the largest single blocks of stone in Hajar-Im, with the dimensions there weighing more than 20 tons, and here we're talking in the Stone Age period. However, these megalithic monuments transcend the physical dimension and point towards more elusive, intangible, cosmic qualities. To borrow a quotation from Louis Kahn, monumentality in architecture may be defined as a quality, a spiritual quality, in a structure which conveys the feeling of its eternity, that it cannot be added to or changed. The Hypogeum, an underground burial complex, a necropolis, entirely rock-cut, metaphorically speaking, conceived as a womb in Mother Nature, Mother Earth, encapsulates the spiritual qualities alluded to by Louis Kahn. Now we'll make a big leap forward and consider some of the monuments and architecture built by the Order of St. John, which was a military and religious order which transformed the Maltese landscape. Now, Malta is also the southernmost frontier, I would say, of Christianity and Baroque culture in Europe. In spite of its minuscule physical size, the arrival of the Knights of the Order of St. John in 1530 was a major turning point in the island's history. The Order of St. John, as a military and religious institution, introduced monumental Baroque architecture in Malta, engaging various architects and military engineers from Italy, France, and Spain. The foundation of a new city by the name of the Valletta in the aftermath of the Great Siege against the Ottoman Turks in 1565, followed by its gradual transformation as a Baroque urban setting, which was only possible by the contribution of eminent foreign architects such as Francesco Bonamici, Romano Carapecchia, Mederico Blondel, and Stefano Ittar. I'll give you some background about the order because it's important to understand basically that it was a multifarious order, a very heterogeneous order, a chivalric institution that was composed initially of 8 different langues or languages, with knights coming from various noble families from Castile, Leon, Aragon, Auvergne, Provence, France, Portugal, Italy, and Germany. The presence of such a diverse multicultural institution on a small island on the peripheral edge of Europe served as the impetus to establish a thriving cosmopolitan milieu on the island. Valletta, the new city of the order, founded in 1566, primarily as a defensive war machine, with the massive line of fortifications around the new city on what was then before a barren peninsula, designed and constructed so as to repel any future Ottoman invasion. And various Italian military engineers were consulted, from Bartolomeo Agenga to Baldassare Lanci, who came up with their own proposals. However, ultimately, it would be Francesco Lapparelli, a military engineer from Cortona, who had even assisted Michelangelo in the construction of the fortifications around the Vatican, who would be entrusted with design of the new city. There is a famous quotation in his codex, which is a very poignant quotation, where he says, there's the threat of the Ottoman Turks coming, and he's writing, "Donami del tempo e ti do vita," as if he's pleading to the drawings that he really wants to incarnate the city from the plans within the shortest possible period of time. The Knights were very keen to ensure that the urban model to be adopted for the new city would be representative of the latest developments of contemporary Renaissance urban culture. Lapparelli's strict orthogonal grid, engirdled with an elaborate network of fortifications, is in stark contrast to the vernacular, that organic form of traditional local Maltese settlements with their maze-like narrow streets and alleys converging to the central square, an urban form more reminiscent of North African and Middle Eastern cities. In such a manner, the Knights, through Lapparelli's plans, were keen to impose an academic urban model that ultimately was more akin to a sophisticated war machine than a normal city. And when it came to the construction of the new city and some of the more important earlier buildings of the order, the Knights had to rely on the engineering and construction skills of the locals, further reinforced with the presence of imported Sicilian workers. In this respect, the engineering abilities and pragmatism of the Maltese architect and engineer Girolamo Cassar stands out, as in Lapparelli's absence, after he presented his plans, he basically left Malta. Cassar was responsible for realizing Lapparelli's plans and the design and construction not only of the fortifications, but of the order's first auberges and various other buildings of the order. It was this dynamic synergy between Laparelli's urban vision and Cassar's hands-on pragmatism that would ensure that Valletta would see the light of day and evolve into the thriving cosmopolitan city it is today. Over the course of the 17th century, Valletta sheds its rather severe and austere architectural appearance that befitted a religious and monastic order into one that gradually embraced monumental Baroque architectural language. And I won't go into details here, but I already mentioned the importance of certain architects like Francesco Buonamici, who were originally came from Lucca, but who was also working in Palazzo Barberini in Rome and others. And he was instrumental in introducing Baroque architecture in Malta. But it was not only the Italian architects who left their imprint on the gradual transformation of Valletta into a Baroque showpiece. We have the French architect Mederico Blondel, who succeeded Buonamici in his post as a resident military engineer of the order and designed several important buildings like the Auberge de Provence. The Knights always sought to commission established foreign architects, sculptors, and artists to design and embellish their buildings. As an order of international standing, they consistently strove to import the latest artistic movements on the continent. However, one should not dismiss the contribution of emerging local architects and artists who were mentored by their more illustrious counterparts. Some of the Maltese architects' names, which are probably not familiar to you, like Tommaso Dingli, later Lorenzo Gaffà, had risen through the ranks. And although they did not have the opportunity to pursue a formal academic education, they came from families of long-established scalpellini, or stone carvers, and scultori. At an early age, they would have been directly exposed to the construction activities at the building site, and with their artisanal background, they would have absorbed the more formal principles from academically trained foreign architects supervising the works. The overtly rhetorical stance of the Baroque was particularly well suited for the Order of St. John's political objectives. The order strove to promote itself as a brave and triumphant one, where the knights, and to a lesser extent the locals, were constantly engaged fighting the Ottoman Muslim forces, and that Malta was a bulwark of Christianity, basically, and that the knights would basically save Western Europe from the Ottoman threat. So here they are on this peripheral outpost as valiant defenders on the Christian faith. We see this fresco here entitled The Allegory of the Triumph of the Order of St. John by the renowned Calabrian artist Mattia Preti in St. John's Co-Cathedral, showing basically a representation of the order with the flag of the Order of St. John. Basically, we see in the background the fallen Ottoman warriors, and then here an important part of the mission of the knights was to take care of the sick, and also the role of the Knights, the Order, as a powerful naval force within the Mediterranean. This representation of the Order is vividly encapsulated in this fresco. This is an oil-on-stone painting in the lunette over the main doorway to St. John's Conventual Church, and formed part of a series of frescoes along the vaulted ceiling that depicted the life and martyrdom of St. John the Baptist. In 1661, Preti was commissioned by the order to undertake the entire fresco cycle, a commission which took him 6 years to be completed. This is a tangible manifestation of the emergence of the Baroque triumphant during the course of the 17th and 18th century, a radical transformation of St. John's Cathedral from the somber, dark, almost cavernous interior into a resplendent interior of the cathedral, replete with all these high marble sculptures and funerary monuments, Preti's fresco cycle, the tombstones of the knights, and the various funerary monuments of past Grand Masters, which are prominently displayed in the chapels of the various langs of the order. Every lang had its own side chapel, all of them that were basically under the jurisdiction of the various langs. So the reification of the term Baroque within the Maltese context can be defined in the form of a highly charged rhetorical and propagandistic modes of artistic representation that represented the order as a staunch defender of the Christian faith, as an influential power broker within the Mediterranean region. On another level, Baroque art forms were also appropriated by the local ecclesiastical authorities and disseminated at the grassroots level. Beyond Valletta, the city of the order, Baroque-style churches were being built in various towns and villages in accordance with the local vernacular and beyond the formal strictures of the academy. Whereas, in contrast to the Order of St. John, who preferred to engage foreign architects, the diocese church, the local church, commissioned Maltese architects and master masons to design and build the local parish churches. And here we've got a very interesting example of a mid-18th century parish church in the small village of Arp in the minor island of Gozo. So although from a typological point of view, the church appears to be inspired by the Baroque church of Sant'Agnese in Piazza Navona, the architect in charge, a local architect, together with the local scalpellini and stone carvers, gave the church a distinctive scenographic imprint where the rather naive sculptural decoration takes center stage, and the display of finely executed sculptural works by the local stone carvers is manifested in a number of small churches and chapels dispersed throughout the island. Now, whenever a new Grand Master was elected, there was a tradition that he would conduct the so-called possesso of the old medieval capital, the Città Notabile, where the Grand Master would symbolically be presented with the keys to the city by the Capitano della Verga, who would be like the podestà or the mayor of the city. For the occasion, a monumental ceremonial gateway in wood, in timber, but decorated with all kinds of decoration and sculptural accoutrements, would be erected as a landmark along a processional route undertaken by the Grand Master. These two designs of scenographic sets are by Pietro Paolo Troisi, and it just happens that the first one is basically the single-arched opening gate was for a Grandmaster Zondadari in 1720. Unfortunately, he only lived for 2 years, so they recycled the arch, and they rebuilt a bigger arch for the next Grandmaster, who was Marco Antonio de Vilhena from Lisbon. And it is recorded that the material was recycled from the previous arch. Now, as I said, scenography became very important. As the threat of the Ottoman invasion abated, the Order of St. John became more conscious of its image and projecting itself in the guise of a European sovereign court. So monumental scenography became very relevant during the 18th century in projecting an absolutist image of the order. And we have an example here of the rebuilding of an auberge, the Auberge de Castile and Leon, that today serves as the Prime Minister's office, in Valletta, that was rebuilt on a more monumental scale and in an ornate Baroque architectural style. So whereas the earlier buildings of the order were devoid of decoration and were rather severe in their external appearance, now architecture becomes far more ornate, richer in terms of sculptural decoration and allegorical imagery. These scenography and explicit political rhetoric were closely affiliated with each other. And this is particularly manifested as well in the design of scenographic centerpieces like staircases, where basically we see the external staircase which flows in, and then actually there is an internal staircase which is just as monumental. And another example in the former Museum of Fine Arts, this wonderful scenographic staircase by an architect by the name of Andrea Belli, who was inspired by the grand opulent Baroque staircases that you'd find in the Belvedere Palace in Vienna and as well in the Stadtpalace by Bernhard Fischer von Erlach as well in Vienna. The Knights were keen on creating their own monuments and embedding them within the local landscape. Valletta was ultimately an urban creation intended to embody the image and ethos of the Knights. Valletta was the city of the order. and hence it reflected the absolutist power of the order. Now, the Order of St. John was basically expelled by Napoleon in 1798. There was a short French interlude of 2 years, so hardly any buildings were built during that unstable 2-year period. And then we have the beginning of the British colonial rule. So this brings us to another dimension of monumentality. Malta still was a fortress island and a strategic military base for the British Navy in the Mediterranean. Now, the British sought to temper the image of Valletta as the city of the order into that of the capital of a British colony. This it did with overt and explicit political imagery. The foisting of British imperial insignia on main gateways and public institutional buildings. The erection of a monument to the British monarch, Queen Victoria, in one of the main public spaces, squares of Valletta, and other high-visibility urban interventions within the city, such as the transformation of the old previous gate by the Knights, the Porta del Monte, into the Victoria Gate, obviously dedicated to Queen Victoria in 1884. Although the British invested heavily in the island's fortifications, barrack camps, and naval military hospitals, they also commissioned and financed other major public projects. And one of these major urban projects was the Royal Opera House, designed by architect Edward Middleton Barry, which really served as an icon. It had a very iconic presence in the city until such time that this building was destroyed during the German Luftwaffe bombing in 1943. Other examples even of architecture from beyond. This is a project that was commissioned by the Ottoman Sultan to build an Ottoman Muslim cemetery in Malta in a neo-Ottoman style, reflecting basically this issue of Orientalism. In a way, it's a catharsis that the Ottomans, although failing to conquer Malta and the Great Siege, somehow managed to have this great, magnificent building as a Muslim cemetery in a British colony. British colonial rule also spelled a major shift in architectural style from the Baroque, which was the prevailing style during the period of the Order of St. John, and into neoclassicism. However, the local church became the sole interlocutor in ensuring the continuum of Baroque monumental forms. The Baroque, as disseminated in the local towns, can be perceived as a form of religious-based counter-response to Anglo-neoclassicism and the various historical revival styles that were espoused by the British authorities. And one can postulate that the Baroque language at the local grassroots level constituted a so-called architecture of resistance to the Anglicizing efforts of British colonial authorities. So we have the main public buildings and monuments commissioned by the British colonial government, usually expressed in a neoclassical style or in variations of Romanticism. But the Baroque during the 19th and early 20th century, although stylistically passé on the European continent, it still persisted in various variations in Malta. Leonard Mahoney made the following observation. The popularity of the Baroque style, especially in church architecture, never died out. So it would be wrong to describe the latter as a revivalist style. What would seem in other countries as absurdly anachronistic is nothing of the sort in the local environment, where the tradition of building in the Baroque style is unbroken and where the once courtly style has now become the common man's expression of affluence and splendor. The lingering predilection for the Baroque was actively promoted by the local ecclesiastical authorities, as it considered it an authentic display of Maltese Catholic sentiment to be seen within the context of British Protestant colonial rule. Independence in 1964, that was marked another important milestone when Malta gained independence from Britain. And one important post-Second World War example is this so-called huge new parish church dedicated to St. John the Baptist in a very small village in Shokia, Gozo, constructed in 1951 to 1978. It is a church that, although designed by a Maltese architect, is almost a copy of Baldessere Longena's church in Santa Maria della Salute. For a small village with a population of a few thousands, the enterprise of building such a monumental church towering over the village skyline verges on what would seem to be the megalomaniac. One can only attribute the underlying motive as a yearning by the local community seeking wider recognition, and that such an iconic building would affirm its autonomous status in relation to the other parishes of Gozo. Art historian Hanno Walter Kruft commented as follows on this church. And what is interesting here, we see the old Baroque church being used and the new church being built around it. And now here, once the new church is complete, they're dismantling the one within. It's like babushka architecture, one within the other, you know, and you see them working. Unfortunately, the older church was a very fine piece of architecture. Hanno Walter Kruft had written as follows: the interior of a building like this is quite remarkable. The perfection of the stone craftsmanship exhales the same coolness and rigidity as one often observes in the handling of observes in 19th century buildings. The proportions of the architectural elements and the handling of light actually places the building in a tradition in which architecture is canonically understood, and Vignola seems to have lain on the architect's table. One can argue that as a devoutly Catholic country where secularism has only made inroads in the last few decades, the Baroque zeitgeist has conditioned the locals to warmly embrace Baroque monumental forms as authentic manifestations representative of the community's affection for the cults of patron saints, village feasts, and religious festivities. Maltese Baroque is perceived more as an ethos or zeitgeist, timeless way of life, rather than as a time-bound armed form. Now, the attainment of independence, besides being a major political milestone, also led to a debate about what issues relating to Maltese national identity, and for an authentic architecture that would reconcile modernism with the local vernacular. This posed new challenges as regards discourse relating to monumentality, now shorn of the representations of colonial power. Richard England, then a young emerging Maltese architect, designed this new parish church for a rural hamlet in what was then a small farming community. And he actually designed the church influenced very much by even these very humble and modest core-built stone huts that one found in the landscape. The church was one of the first post-Vatican Council II churches to be built in Malta, and a pioneering modernist church. England consciously rejected pressures from the local ecclesiastical authorities to construct a historicist-inspired church. Instead, he conceived a new parish church as a modernist interpretation of local vernacular architecture. The interlocking curved forms of the church recall both the typology of the local megalithic temples, where they show the plans of Indra, and the personal reinterpretation of Le Corbusier's Ronchamp Chapel. These are some other views of the same church in Manicata. And an interior view, there was a whole debate when he designed as the back to the altar this masonry rubble wall as, again, a continuity of the landscape within the church. The very conservative archbishop at that time was certainly not amused. He asked him, make sure you get a plasterer to plaster that over. You know, he was an extremely conservative bishop who would not take that, but anyhow, the architect resisted. Now, nature as an expression of monumentality, and we've seen this in some of the presentations earlier today, has always inspired architects seeking either to emulate or partake of its spirit. Consider the case here of what this famous Azur window in Dueira, an imposing geological formation shaped over the years by the forces of nature and emerging around the mid-19th century as an iconic landmark for tourists and visitors alike. I believe it was also a scenographic drop for Games of Thrones as well. After years of unrelenting erosion, during a storm in April of 2017, the Azur window collapsed in its entirety. The absence of memory can be very disconcerting. the current government issued a public call of proposals for ideas relating to the post-collapse situation. There was only one submission. Hold your breath for this, a proposal by the Russian architect Svyatozar Andreev, who sought to reinstate the monumental form of the original Adzur window, this time a man-made structure incorporating the multi-purpose center enclosed within an external envelope made of titanium sheeting. Julio Lafuente's project. Julio Lafuente was a Spanish-Italian architect. These are the beautiful Tachench cliffs in Sannat and Gozo. In the 1967, he designed a project for a cliff-hanging hotel off the coast, Tachench coast, which has to be viewed within the context of the futuristic technological conjectures of Jona Friedman and Buckminster Fuller. The cellular grid-like facade of the proposed hotel was to be built within man-made fractures excavated out of the sheer cliff face with a slender panoramic glass lift that would go all the way to the sea level. It is a scheme that is monumental, not only in terms of its physical scale, but in its conception and unconstrained audacity. And these are a section through the cliff-hanging hotel showing the panoramic lift. This was obviously never realized, but featured heavily in even one of the texts by Sybil Mohalinagi, The Matrix of Man, in the late 60s. In recent years, the entrance to Valletta has been transformed with a major project by Renzo Piano that encompassed a new entrance to the city, what was originally known as the old fascist period gate. It was about the fourth gate in the series. And a new parliament building that we see here, close to the Cavalier of the Order of St. John. And these are the ruins of the leftover ruins of the old Barry Royal Opera House. Renzo Piano was basically commissioned to undertake the design of the parliament. Initially, it was supposed to be on the ruins of the Opera House, but Renzo Piano, in a way, convinced the government that that should remain as kind of ruins, as a memory of the past. It is now part of the collective memory of Valletta, and that the parliament building should be constructed on the vacant site next to it, which was a vacant site as well, as a result of post-war destruction. Renzo Piano's parliament building was designed as two interconnected structures raised on pilotis and serving as a modern counterfoil to the imposing mass of the historic St. James Cavalier that we see in the background here. And St. James Cavalier was an integral part of the land front fortifications of the Knights. The critical line of inquiry is whether monumental imposing forms are appropriate for the representation of the most important democratic institution on the island. However, one cannot address the issue without relating it to context. In this case, Valletta, as I've repeatedly said, conceived as a war machine with lines of massive fortifications and military defenses, and Piano, in a way, adopted a dual approach. In the case of the main entrance to the city, he resisted the temptation of creating a monumental gateway, as this would be perceived as being historicist and anachronistic. And he presented the entrance to the city as a breach in the fortification walls, in a way saying that now Valletta, in the 21st century, welcomes you within its folds. It no longer seeks to close its door and restrict access to the city, and welcomes any visitors within. For the parliament building, however, Piano felt that he should seek to emulate and reinterpret the mass of the fortifications, creating an elevated building using local stone as an exterior shell for the building. Monuments could provide a stimulus to challenge and provoke the status quo. Consider the temporary installation of the controversial temporary monument entitled Zime. In Maltese, Zimel means horse. This is without an L. And if you look closely, this is a bronze representation of a three-legged horse placed on a plinth in front of Parliament. There are multiple interpretations, with the most common being that of an imperfect or flawed society or institution. The last, and this is another example. Today, actually the temporary installation today has been sold to a private arts museum in Stockholm. It's no longer in Malta. The last case study I'll be presenting is a rather subversive reversal of the use of a historic monument. So here we have the appropriation of an important national monument representing the victory of the Great Siege, and its context is very important because this is placed right in front of the Law Courts building, the National Law Courts building. And this has, in the past year and a half, been the site of a memorial for basically to commemorate the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was a fearless journalist who, through her online writings, exposed several high-profile cases of bribery, money laundering, corruption within the upper echelons of the political class. She paid a very high price as she was brutally murdered in a car bomb explosion. To this day, although there are 3 men facing charges, the mastermind or minds behind the assassination are to this day unknown. The national monument dedicated to the victory of the Great Siege in front of the Law Courts building has been adopted, transformed into a memorial place by those demanding justice. However, during the past months, systematically, whenever flowers, candles, and photographs of her were placed at the foot of the monument, these would be summarily removed during the night. The powers even ventured to temporarily fence off the monument by putting in hoarding on the flimsy pretext that urgent restoration works were required to deprive access to the monument. Recently, during a debate at the European Parliament, the Dutch MP, Pieter Omtzigt, questioned why the government persisted in erasing the journalist's memory by removing candles and flowers placed at the spontaneous memorial in Valletta. As reported in the press, the response by the local Minister for Justice was that the government had not stopped anyone from placing candles and flowers by the Great Siege monument. Furthermore, he added, the monument to Antonio Shortino, one of Malta's best talents, had suffered damage from the candles and flowers and needed to be restored. After restoration, people were once again free to hold activities at the memorial, but all candles and flowers were removed once the activity ended. One can interpret this declaration as being ambivalent at the very best, implying a reluctance to forcefully suppress acts of dissent, but on the other hand, actively seeking to erase the memory of the assassinated journalist. In conclusion, I refer to the definition of a monument as postulated by Josip Sert, Leger, Fernand Leger, and Siegfried Gideon in a joint statement entitled The 9 Points on Monumentality, and I'm only going to quote the first one. Monuments are human landmarks which men have created as symbols for their ideals, for their aims and their actions. These are intended to outlive the period which originated them and constitute a heritage for future generations. As such, they form the link between the past and the future. Monuments and monumental buildings are embedded within Malta's urban fabric. Some are passive reminders of the memory of past colonial times, whilst others are potent and active sources of interrogation and inquiry, challenging us to question the status quo, our state of moral being, and our aspirations for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move now from Malta to Mumford. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Next speaker is Inderbir Singh Riar. He's one of this year's postdoctoral fellows at the Getty Research Institute. Trained as an architect and an architectural historian, he is associate professor in the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Inderbir's interests include the ways in which architects and bureaucrats imagined the post-war metropolis as producing ideal citizenries. This theme has informed studies on the French banlieue, Ideologies of Reconstruction in West Germany, and his first book project entitled Expo 67, The Architecture of Late Modernity, which he is completing here at the Getty. Inderbir's work has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Graham Foundation, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and the Japan Foundation. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and of course, thank you, Elizabeth, for the cough drops, which I've been taking all day today, or this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I wish to, before beginning, thank Dr. Alexa Sakura and the GRI for this kind but undeserved invitation. Undeserved because this talk compiles a project begun only last autumn, hence the rather provisional title of Notes. The story proceeds in 3 parts, with an epilogue. The period is mid-century America. The centerpiece is a towering modernist icon, and the protagonist is also the antagonist. I'm not, alas, an expert on Lewis Mumford, American cultural history, much less monumentalism. Nevertheless, I'll try to sound authoritative on each one. With these caveats in mind, I begin. Lewis Mumford, American man of letters, public intellectual, philosopher of technology, sociologist, architecture historian, regional planner, and self-defined generalist who lived the length and breadth of the 20th century, hated this building. The United Nations headquarters, completed in New York in 1952, would embody everything Mumford feared of post-war politics, culture, and aesthetics. In short, everything he dreaded of monumentality. Mumford's life work explored the relationship of technology to anonymous concentrations of power. He advanced an ecological humanism that upheld community, regionalism, and selfhood as bulwark against the anonymous state. Modern architecture was to play a crucial role in this new civics. Most observers saw the UN buildings as testament to peace and progress. Mumford disagreed, often violently. Why did Mumford, a progressive, rather radical thinker, propose an utterly iconoclastic, in fact, inhospitable reading of an apparent shrine to freedom and fellowship? To understand this is to trace an alternate path cut through the politics of technology, society, and architecture in the 20th century. We begin then at the beginning. Hopes. Lewis Mumford's worldview, outlined in the 1920s and defined in the 1930s, rested on a core belief to see history as moral archaeology. Through the 1920s and 30s, Mumford and his New York circle of writers and critics, as well as architects and planners, worked to define a new form of organic community. Its basis extended, they maintained, in communal structures and aesthetic language predating the modern state. Across critical studies encompassing American culture, including architecture, Mumford reread the 19th century not as crucible of modernization, but as vessel of what he called a usable past, a deep reservoir of tradition, resistant to the homogenizing tendencies of industrial life and, one could say, industrialized politics, thus to teleology and determinism. Indebted to the likes of Emerson and Ruskin, Mumford sought a social paradigm balancing self-expression and personality that could counter residual Victorian traits of self-reliance and character, still propelling modern thought and action. Grand modernizations captured Mumford's imagination. His thoughts crystallized in one word: technics. Technics distinguished mere machines from the machine understood as a technological complex encompassing tools, skills, machines, knowledge, and arts. Mumford began to address the rise and nexus of capitalism, the growth of the state, the ferment of the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of the managerial economy. His magnum opus, Technics and Civilization of 1934, unfolded the long duration of the rationalization of labor, which in breathtaking analysis he traced to the advent of the clock in the medieval monastery that established all consequent coordination of thought and action. With the neologism neotechnics, Mumford described a nascent frontier of abundant materials and forces, abundant being a favorite word. Aluminum, the dynamo, hydroelectricity, all available for universal distribution. Like a good 1930s modernist, Mumford held to doctrines of efficiency when seeking a technological solution to the crisis of bourgeois individualism. Dreams of communal association and spiritual uplift needed the enlightened, nonpartisan, technocratic controls of machines and technology. Undertakings such as the Tennessee Valley Authority proved neotechnics as a statist program of reform, one that ushered social concord. Crucial to such interpretations was Mumford's expanding politics of regionalism. The heuristic utopia of regionalism differed from classical notions on progress, which Mumford saw as feeding industrial calamity, urban ruin, and environmental degradation, whether under liberal democracy, planned socialism, or totalitarianism. Regionalism found people balanced among many poles: the state, the city, the community, the environment, the family. Mutual aid, charitable trust, guild ethos. Such forms of voluntary association imply the rights of collective decision-making without any mediation by political authority and its compromises. Unsurprisingly, Mumford advocated the lessons of the turn-of-the-century reformer Ebenezer Howard, whose Garden City envisioned networks of moderate-sized industrial and trading towns in harmony with agriculture. The civic ideal relied on romantic interpretations of medieval cooperation: market, guild hall, cathedral. Mumford's favored examples evoked a citizenry as spiritual, social, and political participants in building their own history, in controlling their own destiny. Architecture occupied a central role in Mumford's regionalism. The design of better cities drove his history of social rejuvenation. The finest examples, to Mumford's mind, appeared in Weimar-era housing estates. Here emerged genuinely modern interpretations of the Garden City. Seen in Mumford's contribution on housing to the landmark 1932 Museum of Modern Art exhibition that popularized the so-called international style, a term Mumford disliked, the German efforts emphasized conspicuous economy over conspicuous waste. In other words, a nexus of enlightened politics and sociology undergirded an environment of technical and aesthetic liberation. In positioning modern architecture as a social good, Mumford opposed a far greater and more pernicious force: monumentality. Pre-war statements had Mumford equating the monument with death, not life, immortality over biological renewal, permanence versus cycle of nature, and heaviness, never lightness. These were, of course, the conspicuous traits of known totalitarianisms. The post-war milieu brought graver challenge. As architects everywhere pursued reconciliation of functionalism with more humanistic concerns, Mumford cautioned that qualities of symbolism, aesthetic expressiveness, or civic dignity were almost as insidious as monumentalism. Moreover, the machine no longer offered stimulating visual metaphors for rejuvenated life. How could it, after all, after the depredations of another world war? Democracy needed to remain wary of monuments, especially ones trafficking in accepted modernist style that spoke of internationalism, but in fact only extended the covert imperialism of the great world megalopolises, claiming, as Mumford put it, to dominate the culture of their time. Mumford's fight against monumentalism was bookended by war. Years earlier, he had thundered against American liberal pragmatist intellectuals like John Dewey, acquiescing to the First World War. In their zeal for an immense impetus to reorganization, they had surrendered values to technique. Years later, he castigated another liberal mindset, preventing American entry to the Second World War and the crucial fight against fascism. How then to symbolize life, the renaissance of public life after 1945? Mumford optimistically foresaw mid-century culture passing from what he said, an ideology of the machine to an ideology of the organism and the person. On the other hand, he came some years later to describe a far different paradigmatic techniques at work. He called it the world as extermination camp, the ultimate destination of unqualified power, released from all organic disciplines and humane inhibitions. These were the tensions biosocial reconstruction versus oblivion, pressing upon 1948, upon the social foundations of post-war building, upon the true course of Pax Americana. A monument. The United Nations culminated modernity. To many, the long arc of the Enlightenment ended in the efficient slaughter of human beings justified by invented sciences of racial and biological difference. The United Nations Charter promised then to save the world from war. It was signed by 50 of 51 member states on June 26, 1945, before, of course, Hiroshima. Concerns of peace and security were quickly abrogated. Instead, questions of science, education, development, and culture soon shaped reflection on inalienable needs, human rights, including political, economic, and cultural ones, established fundamental principles of equality, rippling through international covenants and national legislations. Here lay a foundation, partially reconstructed, partially invented, partially rebuilt, of universal thought and action. Its edifice, to be a domain of liberty and diversity, required a proper home. First came the city. New York not only suggested a dynamic and worldly domain, but gave comfort in its remove from interminable old world hatreds. Early schemes for a world capital unsurprisingly proved bombastic. Amalgams of heroic 1920s metropolitanism and reassuring 1930s state classicism. Then came the money. In a bid at immortality, John D. Rockefeller Jr., the American Medici, cut a check to buy 17 acres of Midtown Manhattan slaughterhouses and tenements along the East River. His magnanimity was duly celebrated. Few bothered to mention how much his nearby land holdings would skyrocket in value. Finally came the architects. From February to June 1947, 10 designers nominated by their nations, led by the American Wallace Harrison, architect of Rockefeller Center, convened to ensure that planning would exist on a truly international collaborative basis. Their task was clear: to give the UN its form. Among them was Le Corbusier. His presence served as redemption or revenge for the great fiasco of modern architecture, the failure to realize his League of Nations years earlier. His presence allowed assuming the continuity of pre-war avant-garde ideals, removed from the vicissitudes of the European theater within the ambit of resurrected utopianism. Le Corbusier certainly thought so. His Scheme 23A, a fragment of his pre-war Ville Radieuses fitted to the Manhattan gridiron, upheld the skyscrapers, correcting the flaws of urban life, thus serving as the engine of social rebirth in the second machine age. The Harrison team's final report synthesized Le Corbusier's ideas. The UN Secretariat stood apart, a towering slab for the so-called Workshop of Peace. Behind it, a conference block sat low along the East River. Out front, the lozenge-shaped General Assembly, where nations were to gather, provided a symbolic gateway. A fourth building, eventually unrealized, housed international delegations. Everything floated in verdant tranquility. As architecture critic of The New Yorker, a position he would hold for 30 years, Lewis Mumford waited to be impressed. From his frontline vantage, he followed every change in plan and every change in ambition. Compatriots in architecture journals and newspapers waxed poetic. Mumford stood apart. In columns penned between 1947 and 1952, Mumford assessed the UN from inception to completion. His text trenchantly and defiantly parsed modernism and globalism at mid-century. Things started with the site. The 17.5 acres were merely a flea bite. Having jumped at Rockefeller's philanthropy, the UN now faced the difficult impression of accepting a gift from the paragon of monopoly capitalism, something likely to raise, as Mumford put it, suspicions and animosities among many member states. Realty speculation hardly provided a basis for the comedy of peoples. The urgent concern was one of meaning. The UN report emphasized, Mumford wrote, all the right architectural concepts: integration, organism, flexibility, expansion. The plans revealed the opposite: rigidity, confinement. Well before the Secretariat was completed, Mumford predicted that as a symbol, it would simply show that the managerial revolution has taken place and that bureaucracy rules the world. The arid neutralism of the smaller buildings only served to magnify the Secretariat. That it towered over the General Assembly defeated the purpose. Primacy was never accorded to the one space in which all nations were meant to gather. Instead, a skyscraper now signified, Mumford despairingly wrote, everything distant people feared and hated about the United States: our slick mechanization, our awful power, our patronizing attitude towards lesser breeds who've not acquired the American way of life. The transposition of American ways for UN principles seemed writ large in the Secretariat grid. Every segment, every module, extending the atomizing practice of bureaucracy across the glass skin and into the deepest recesses of the building. Years earlier, Mumford's resonant historicizing had positioned the clock as a definitive machine of rationalized life. The clock dulled the cacophony of the industrial world by setting the even register to which bodies or parts of bodies moved, swayed, and turned over and over to the unceasing ticking of modernity. So the clock, so the grid. Each parceled space-time to organize work and life, habit and cognition, in short, to turn intuition into routine. What possible option remained against the grid? Mumford had, in fact, once intimated what the UN could be. Addressing the Royal Institute of British Architects in August 1947, he proposed a world center for the United Nations. Two values had reached a decisive climax. First, the UN marked the evolutionary culmination of a will to unite humankind. Second, the Garden City still offered a statement on transnational fellowship. The UN must arise strictly within a world metropolis, Mumford stated. Only a site of 3,000 acres, 4 times Central Park, readied by slum clearance would do. The world city would be balanced, not just assembly buildings, but housing, schools, and hospitals. Up to 50,000 people would live there. Its realization would become litmus of all post-war reconstruction. The heroic architectures of great capitals held no lessons for the present. Capitals meant centers of war. Eradicating war required world cities spanning the globe as agents of peace. Such dispersal, with UN staff changing every 5 years, would, Mumford insisted, demonstrate the essential principle of social relativity, whereby any part of the world could become a center of international life. Social relativity. Mumford's vision for the UN offered not architecture per se, but a way of living. Mumford had always sought a shared language of form that could unite Americans and eventually all peoples in a compact of public dialogue. Modern democracy required a successor to the agora or the medieval square, a sphere where citizens could act as makers and critics of a common culture at once rooted in tradition and open to the innovation of other societies. What did such a world city look like? Mumford's UN critique never made it clear. Nevertheless, a suggestion came from an admired source. In the work of Matthew Nowicki, a Polish émigré architect, Mumford discovered a commitment to a genuine universalism in which the intimate and the personal attributes of a local culture mingled with the norms and forms common to people in our time. Nowicki died in 1950, but not before leaving preliminary plans for Chandigarh, the new Punjab capital in post-partition India. Exactly these designs, these drawings, provided Mumford with an antithesis to the United Nations. The strength of modern architecture depended on recourse to tradition, not slavish imitation, but the capacity to harness indigeneity, the particularities of climate, landscape, and materials and techniques, renewed by critical borings and interpretations of other cultures. Nowicki's drawings betrayed sensitivity to such patterns. Evidence, Mumford claimed, the machine-age anti-historicism, anti-regionalism, and anti-humanism hardly signaled the last word in human culture. That Nowicki's formal language, according to Mumford, only became enriched by encounters with India, proved the need for intercultural hybridity, or what Mumford termed syncretism, essential to self-repair, self-renewal, self-transcendence. Such mixing, the interpenetration and transformation of ideas from one civilization or epoch to another, served to withstand pointless venerations of nationhood. The political lesson lay in Nowicki's comfortingly irregular interrelations of human gathering and sensations of inhabiting the ground, a frank anti-monumentality. With this resistance of the vernacular came a communitarian critique of the post-war liberal consensus. Personal intimacy, emotional depth, moral commitment, social cohesion, continuity in time. Only these could guard against heedless cosmopolitanism, dismantling only these could guard against the heedless cosmopolitanism, dismantling tradition that bred intolerance. Mumford long argued for a public culture of direct community engagement given a corresponding aesthetics of open-air democracy. Read this way, Nowicki's Chandigarh shaped a middle ground between the particularism of community with all its separatist tendencies and the crowd with its leveling and sameness. Read this way, Nowicki's architecture provided a social contract at odds with the one imagined inside the UN, not the stage of debate and resolutions, but a commons of conversation and handshakes. Majoritarianism versus consensus, the instrumental language of statecraft and technique versus the symbolic language of aesthetic experience and moral judgment, Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft, community or society, self-determination or bureaucratization. As always, it was to watch warily as culture became adapted to the money economy and bourgeois values. The supreme test for mid-century society remained in resisting the quantification of the inner private realm, the sanctuary where sentiment and imagination resided. Only this could allow erecting a life world outside predestination and predetermination, or for that matter, the regimentation and segmentation wrought by the curtain wall. Fears. Mumford's history was cyclical: attainment of form, loss of form, renewal of order. His schema laid at odds with meta-historical narrative, whether Whig, liberal, or Marxist, constantly setting culturalism against the nation state, basically the animating tension behind all regionalisms. Mumford eschewed grand designs of revolution, each driven by the desire to reconstitute the state. Every aspect of Mumford's thought flowed from one theme: the banishment of the organic by the technical. The UN had become a monument to the mechanical, to the replacement of qualitative uniqueness and multivocal expression by standardization, specialization, massification, centralization, and decontextualized differentiation. Hence the question, was Mumford's censure of the UN an architectural critique or a rally against the machine age? The machine age bestowed the command of magister mundi, essential to pre-war totalitarianisms. Frankenstein associations of power and productivity also belong to industrial democracy, specifically to my own generation, Mumford had once admitted, and its ready embrace of the redemptive power of science and technology. The most pernicious or crippling effects of technology did not necessarily reside in outward acts of destruction, however horrifying, but in inward evacuations of meaning, in making inert all functions of life. When Mumford accused the UN architects of achieving nothing more than an empty abstract form, reflecting the emptiness and purposelessness of modern techniques as now conceived, he might as well have described the flawless shape of that other towering post-war monument, the nuclear blast. Tower or mushroom cloud. Each perfectly proportioned silhouette hid internal reactions that remained the secret province of specialists. Each made negligible other kinds of power. The omnipotence of these techniques, the Promethean power of limitless energy, assaulted the public language of forms and symbols, practical reason and moral wisdom, capable of challenging authoritarian technology. Here existed, Mumford said in 1952, the year the UN was completed, the realm of post-historic man. The man without memory or hope, adrift in a world where technological demands outpace genuine human needs of initiative, power of choice, self-government, in short, freedom and creativeness. The specter of people willfully divorced from ethical historical reckonings portended Mumford's darkening view on modernity. Only those who would depart from the human norm entirely, Mumford declared, to lay the foundations for that dehumanized creature, post-historic man, precondition for comatose rocket flights into space, have any reason to conceive modern architecture as a complete break from the main trunk of tradition. But for such people, architecture has already ceased to exist. Neither their underground shelters, nor their launching platforms, nor their universal crematoria have the need of an architect. Mumford's prognostication relied, as always, on architecture as a measure of political economy. In this analysis, architecture had already relinquished any critical function. It was perhaps difficult to know whether post-historic man represented a doppelganger, a designation meant for both the masses of people serving technological society, accordingly removed from the reassuring bonds of fellowship, and the priestly class of scientists and technicians guarding the cult of machine romanticism, the mania for precision and repetition that inevitably demanded capitulating to the most stultifying traits of modernity. The very same age viewed human development passing metallically from bronze to iron to steel, a passage Mumford desperately wished to culminate in the redistributive techniques of electricity and advanced alloys, but had already likely ended in the wholly different metallurgical metaphor of Max Weber's iron cage of rising bureaucratization. Seen this way by Mumford, the frozen geometrical concept of the UN, a quite literal iron cage, threatened to replace the creative and independent individual essential to imagining a new world with the impersonal, neutral functionary, obedient only to the science governing his métier. There remained, however, a lacuna. Despite everything, fear of the bomb, anxiety over state power, Mumford neglected the most impenetrable bastion of UN authority. Having chastised the architects for not monumentalizing the General Assembly, the best side of a true globalism, he never acknowledged that the Security Council, the inner sanctum of geopolitics, held the cards. The Security Council represented the coarsest expression of to the victor go the spoils, not necessarily of having won world war, but finally of possessing authority given by the ultimate weapons of mass destruction. The five major powers were originally tasked with maintaining international peace and security by regulating armament, a perversity resolved by thermonuclear stalemate. To Mumford, civilization signified the throwing off of tribal association. Not once did he identify this new tribe of atomic powers as symptom. Even as his UN critique coincided with wholly new articulations of American exceptionalism, Mumford seemed unable to buttress his vigilant architectural criticism with a keener journalism of political fact for usefully displacing or estranging things. Nevertheless, it is in this sense, in the Secretariat rendered as a typology of depersonalization, a replica of replicas fitted only to means-ends calculation, that the UN allowed a profound demarcation in Mumford's outlook. The UN arguably marks the very first instance of Mumford's final and consuming preoccupation, what he came to call megatechnics. In the 1960s, Mumford began considering a radically different condition of life in which people will not only have conquered nature, but will have detached themselves completely from the organic habitat. With this new megatechnics, Mumford nervously conjectured, humankind will create a uniform, all-enveloping structure designed for automatic operation. The culmination was megamachine, or the artificiality of the built realm divorced from natural processes necessary for the metabolic regeneration of life. Megamachine encapsulated Mumford's most prophetic paranoid analysis of the post-war world. The discourse culminated in his two-volume The Myth of the Machine, completed in 1970. Mumford's pre-war thought had traced the antagonism between organic techniques and capitalist acquisitiveness. Now his ruminations bore the imprint of war, fascism, nuclear holocaust, and of course the Cold War. He began tracking the historical conflict between authoritarian and democratic techniques to the dawn of civilization. The salient figure became the Egyptian pyramid. Present-day systems of absolutism, militarism, and mechanization of computer surveillance, nuclear weaponry, and bureaucratic control descended from enormous collections of human capital organized solely to serve a universal religion, positive science, emanating from a divinely ordained power. Resulting mortuary cities testified to the glorification of a few by the perfectly sequenced but unrecognized toil of the many. Whether pyramid complex or space program, the machine represented a centrally organized complex of interchangeable human and physical parts guarded by technocratic monopoly for the material well-being of an elite. Perhaps Mumford's characterization of Megamachine tilted to reckless historicizing. Disembodied abstractions, especially machine metaphors, seem to unmoor history from people and events. The sweeping periodization that produced admirable synchronicities also tended to align discontinuous historical systems. There was always, in Mumford, a muddying rhetoric at work. Yet Megamachine needed to be rhetorical. It had to be in a post-Hiroshima, Vietnam-focused, cybernetic-driven world. Because at the very heart of Mumford's final discourse lay a deeper need to restore democracy. Democracy, Mumford continued to insist in the 1960s, meant placing people above institutions. How is this possible when technology no longer seemed to mediate nature and humans? How is this possible when present-day democracy had absorbed the megamachine to create economies of controlled abundance attuned to a leisure society? How is this possible in grand consolidations of economies ahead of culture? Think the European Union. To understand that megatechnics existed, in Mumford's words, as both a visible universal instrument and the invisible object of collective worship, meant admitting the difficulty of escaping the ideology of progress. The wanted form of progress remained as ever the state, liberal, progressive, socialist, with its mechanisms of reinforcing the central tenet of bourgeois society, to emancipate, in the name of reform and liberation, individuals from the past, family ties, senses of place, and nature itself. Hence Mumford's disdain for the monument. Monumentality as creed stood for process, for large-scale consolidation of values. Yet the greatest of all post-war monuments was hardly architectural, but entirely philosophical, namely, the triumph of a scientific worldview propelling seemingly divergent beliefs, whether Western democracy or so-called communism. Thus, to restore democracy required rejecting the metropolitan mind with its educated contempt for roots. To restore democracy in an epoch of unrest demanded, Mumford wrote, returning the machine to its proper status as an organ subordinate to the human personality, thereby reacquiring its purpose as an instrument of reason. To restore democracy meant refusing the liberal state in its Lockean frame of life and liberty predicated on private property's natural right, and rediscovering a commonweal in the disaggregated political units of regionalism. Rural life, the family, and other pre-modern forms of association preserved mutual aid and solidarity against the twin demons of atomistic individualism and uniform militarism. Architecture could be made central to this effort. Monuments could not. By way of a concluding remark, we might ask, and this is really apropos of nothing, but we might ask, what in the world Lewis Mumford would have made of this? Before dawn on May 9th, 1970, a sleepless Richard Nixon roused his faithful valet and the Secret Service at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. He wished to be driven to the Lincoln Memorial, where anti-war activists had gathered since the Kent State murders some days earlier. Sleepy-eyed demonstrators met a president wondering whether they had seen his televised press conference a few nights before, when he had announced to the nation that the Vietnam War was being expanded to Cambodia. Most hadn't. Nixon tried to explain that his and the students' aims were one and the same, to bring peace. I know that probably most of you think I'm a son of a bitch, the president was heard to say, but I want you to know that I understand just how you feel. It was, White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman noted in his diary that afternoon, the weirdest day so far. It was going to get weirder. Mumford hated the Lincoln Memorial. Perhaps he would have relished the irony of Nixon desperately engaging protesters on its steps. Such corpse-like classicism, paean to measurement and imitation, only produced, Mumford knew, monuments too dead to even be correct. That this architecture crowned American cities, neutralizing the very last touch of vitality, the uses of life crucial to democratic purchase, was symptomatic of the aggrandizing needs of a republic turned war machine. Mumford's sense of cultural renaissance was always assumed a growing popular movement of dissent. Yet when it came time to resist the mega machine, Mumford dismissed the counterculture. Anti-war protest was noble. Withdrawal into sex, drugs, and rock and roll was not. Mumford refused to understand such things as genuine decoupling from megatechnics as pathways along which other form of kinship might grow. These disorders, as he put it, were, he warned, always already commodified, thus stabilizing the megamachine. To levitate the Pentagon, to exercise every last deus ex machina, these acts never could arise in Lewis Mumford's cosmology. Thank you.
So we have two representational images up on the screen that will hopefully guide our questions a bit. Thank you both for wonderful talks. I wanted to actually start out, before we get into questions from the group, with a question for the two of you, which might put you on the spot a bit. But I think you would both probably agree at this point that the vernacular is a kind of resistance against monumentality. I think you presented the vernacular, or indigenous, in two very different ways. I'm wondering if you can define the vernacular for us, or at least if we can tease out a little bit more what that means, and maybe to start a conversation, how you see your definitions of the vernacular relating to one another's contexts.
You first. Okay. Well, at its most basic, I would say vernacular is, I mean, even using the word vernacular architecture is a misnomer, because vernacular is indigenous, local. So, I mean, I would prefer to use the word vernacular expression, because what is being discussed is something that is handed from one generation to another, that is almost encoded in the DNA of the people, you know. So in a way, it's a bit faceless as well. It's something that is timeless and faceless, but it's also something which is very fragile, because what we see is with globalization and industrialization, that sense of the local, of the vernacular, can be squashed and annihilated over time to something totally different. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you do get the sense that the vernacular is seen or projected as something that is inferior to something modern and international. It's something portrayed as being insular, parochial, or at least there are those kind of overtones. So in a way, it does present itself as an antidote to retaining one's identity. Now that becomes a bit of a also controversial issue, because identity, what does it mean? Rejecting internationalism, rejecting modernity. So I don't think it should just be a hermetically sealed vernacular, but a vernacular that is willing to be a fertile vernacular that kind of absorbs modernity, but filters it rather than unquestioningly kind of adopts it. I don't know if I was clear.
No, I think you're highlighting this question of contingent on space, or place rather, which is something that I think Mumford gets at a bit as well, or you get at through Mumford.
Yeah, I mean, I think that whether one's reading Mumford or just thinking generally about the vernacular, there might be three quick things one can say. I think that the domain of the vernacular is the geography of the region. That could be one way of saying that it's not about the concentrations of metropolitan power. The vernacular somehow resides outside of that. Another way to think about it would be if one aligned the word vernacular with the word craft. Craft would be a repository of the techniques of making that also have been handed down through generations, and they can be resistant to homogenizing tendencies, let's say, of the building industry. So that would be the second one. The third would be a more metaphorical one. This comes directly from Mumford, and I'll give you an example of his own thought. In 1959, Mumford writes an incredible essay where he revisits techniques and civilization, and he reassesses his own book, and he's very critical of it. And one can only imagine, one can understand why. I mean, the war and the Cold War has been, of course, crushing to him. It's important to understand that Mumford loses his son in the Second World War, and he writes a 333-page book about his son. It is beautiful, and it's very difficult to read, the last couple of pages. I don't encourage one to read it, but it's incredibly moving and saddening. In 1959, he revisits the question of techniques and civilization, and he says this incredible thing. He makes a distinction between masculine and feminine techniques. Masculine techniques are incredibly shallow. They're utilitarian, they have no memory, and they're completely process-oriented. Feminine techniques are given as, he describes them as vessels. And he gives real examples like baskets, etc. Things that are actually passed down for him through feminine knowledge, through multi-generations. And so once he gives this kind of example of the vessel, he's able to talk about vernacular craft, but that's a very alternative politics for him, because the vessel is about retaining memory. Mm-hmm. And by retaining memory, you are standing against the consolidation of all kinds of other nation-state forces, which are actually, for him, totally opposed to tradition. So in other words, this idea that Hobsbawm has of inventor traditions, Mumford would see that as a total calamity.
Interesting. Yeah, and we have the kind of idea of local tradition through the Scappellini and the others who are engaged in sort of co-opting an international style in the case of the Baroque. So maybe with this in mind, we can open it up. Do we have questions from the room? We've solved monumentality. Nothing more to say. Maybe while you're still thinking, a question for the two of you as well would be that both of you talk in a way about context through the lens of landscape. I think that part of the question with Malta and Valletta is that it's a utopian notion of what a fortified city can be, but with a kind of consciousness about the island and its topography. With the concept of regional planning, something that Mumford is reacting against is the idea that the city becomes hermetically sealed from its landscape. I'm wondering if that's something that either of you could comment more on.
Well, for example, Valletta is an interesting case, because Valletta, was, as I said, conceived as a war machine. So throughout its history, it questions its own raison d'etre. You don't need a war machine in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. So how do you transform something that was intended for one use to make it viable, something valid, something relevant to local society? There's this constant question of reinventing oneself, transforming oneself, but ideally, obviously, trying to retain that sense of historical memory. Yeah. But you also mentioned vernacular, for example, even in the changing landscape that we see today, pressures to build high-rise buildings, pressures to transform the landscape. The use of local limestone, I showed a slide of a local limestone quarry, is becoming defunct because now reinforced concrete, steel, precast materials are used. So even local materials now are becoming used less and less, mm-hmm. which in a way goes back to this question of, the local vernacular in a way is being suppressed mm-hmm. against this really overpowering building development lobby that finds kind of the use of concrete as a much more commercially viable thing, and mm-hmm. these are forces which are difficult to resist.
Right.
Maybe to tie it to some of the talks this morning, the question of regional planning to me is intimately tied to the question of hydroelectricity. I've always really felt that the idea of generating enormous amounts of power is fundamentally about a kind of political purchase. And I can give an example. The interesting thing for me about that is that wave breaks in two ways. On the one hand, the generation of enormous hydroelectricity is a great stab at nationhood. And often hydroelectricity becomes nationalized. You have a monopoly. And where I'm from, in Quebec, that is a sacrosanct thing. We have ultra-cheap electricity that we sell to everybody else. And in fact, this industry was nationalized in 1960, 61, when in fact there was a massive political cultural revolution. That is the first thing that happened. It was taken out from private hands. So you get an idea of constructing a nation-state identity, in this case related to French nationalism, on the backs of the salient feature of hydroelectricity, and that becomes a program that continues to this day. If you receive an electric bill in Quebec, it tells you that hydroelectricity is a green energy. That's insane. But somehow the idea of invisibility and cleanliness, this modernist idea of salubrity, is tied to hydroelectricity and thus tied to the region. Yet hydroelectricity is also part and parcel of the great imaginary regionalism. And we see it in Tony Garnier's Cité Industrielle of 1917. The major source of that are these incredible drawings as a Beaux-Arts guide that he does of hydroelectric dams. But quite interestingly, the other person who was obsessed, I think, of hydroelectricity was Willie Morris. And he was absolutely fascinated by this idea of a power Then in a way you could sort of imagine in Morris's mind replacing the medieval water wheel. That two ideas of a kind of autonomous generation of energy vis-a-vis the region, vis-a-vis culture, in Morris's case, the rescuing of Nordic languages, and craft actually making somehow link in a kind of grand causal chain. I've always been, I have to confess, William Morris is my hero. But I've always been kind of blown away by that he was sort of enchanted by this.
Interesting. I think we had a question from Andrew first, and then I see Nicholas.
So thank you both. And Inderbir, I was hoping you could say a little bit more. You already alluded to the fact that the post-war Mumford and the pre-war Mumford may not align. In the post-war, I think we're all reasonably or somewhat clear about the sort of mass mobilization that Wei Hung was talking about and the nightmare future that produces. But I'm much less familiar with the idea of regionalism in architecture. And I do know something about regionalism in the visual arts, which has been sort of, caricatured as an anti-modernist, which it certainly wasn't. But on the other hand, where it often was seen to lead is something like the 1940 World's Fair, where people lived in planned communities in Queens and on the fair site, and they called it the folk fair, and it seemed very much, by that point, to coincide with the German idea of the folk. So I'm wondering about Mumford's and where that kind of architectural regionalism is supposed to go.
Andrew, thank you. Regionalism for Mumford, as it's articulated in the 1920s and 30s, comes from two sources. One is his intimate circle in the 1920s of what you could broadly say cultural writers in New York, around a series of little magazines and then the New Republic, etc. And he has a cluster of young Americans, Randolph Bourne and others, and they are motivated by a recuperation of American identity that exists outside the grand gestures of the Republic. Mumford traces that to the 19th century, and the two salient figures for him are Emerson on the one hand, and Melville on the other. And Melville's Captain Ahab is Mumford's paradigmatic or personification of modernity. That Ahab's zeal to kill the whale is capitalism. So he's trying to align these kinds of forces in his own thinking. This is the 1920s. By the time the 1920s turn to the 1930s, Mumford is in with a group of regional planners, and they're called the Regional Planning Association of America, the RPAA. And they, in fact, have the ear at times of FDR during the New Deal. But before this, they're already proselytizing a regionalism that Mumford and his compatriots, Clarence Stein, he's an architect planner, they're proselytizing something that they call the fourth migration. The fourth migration is going to be the decentralization of the United States into livable communities. And this is totally predicated on Ebenezer Howard's Garden City ideal. This is not, it's very important to know, this is not anti-metropolitan and it's not anti-modern. Mumford was very suspicious of the 1939 World's Fair, and he writes about that. And the kind of folkloric villages that you're describing would have left him aghast. Mumford does not have any kind of Völkisch mania in the German sense. And this is something that he grapples with. Because I would say that the major currents of intellectual thought in Mumford is Germanic. And that comes from all kinds of readings of German Enlightenment thought, German Romanticism. Goethe is his go-to guy. It comes from the 1920s regional planning of German garden cities. But it also comes from Spengler. And the word technics that Mumford takes, it's mainly from a British geographer named Patrick Geddes, but he's also indebted to Oswald Spengler. Spengler writes about technics. Mumford is very wary of Spengler. He gives him his due, but he basically writes that Spengler, and this is maybe a slightly unfair assessment because I think that sometimes the jury's out on Spengler, he basically writes that Spengler's pessimism leads to totalitarianism. And Mumford is aghast at cultural pessimism in the 1920s and 30s because he sees that by surrendering this idea of, to death and decay, one only paves the way for doctrines of death and decay and renewal in very dark senses. Regionalism for Mumford is quite literally a movement away from those kinds of doctrines to a new form of democratic purchase, of self-governance. And it's no surprise that you'll hear the terms guild hall, market hall, cathedral, endlessly repeated in this period. That is Mumford's cosmology. It is not a religious one. It is about the self-organization of decentralized democracy. And regionalism is absolutely part of that. Nothing that they plan ever gets realized, except in bits and pieces. So Sunnyside Gardens is a planned community in Queens. That Mumford lives there. It's his friends who do it. He's a great apostle of it. And the other thing that's extremely important on a monumental scale is the Appalachian Trail. And Benton McKay, who's the force behind the Appalachian Trail, who's Mumford's friend, he gets that through under FDR. And that's another form of regionalism. And they see this as completely living outside the cities.
I think our next question was from Nicholas in the front. I don't know if we have a mic nearby or project.
All right. It's another question for Inderbir. I'm wondering about Mumford's ideas about the General Assembly, because in my mind it performs a very different form of monumentality than the Secretariat slab. It's chock full of art, a lot of it of dubious quality, of aesthetic merit, or whatever you want it. But there's something slightly different going on in the assembly. The very fact of, it wasn't, not all of what I'm going to describe was there when it was finished, but it was definitely there during Mumford's life. Things such as the Guernica tapestry, right where the diplomats are going to enter to see Guernica again before making a decision, or the composition in the Security Council by a Norwegian artist whose name I forget. This kind of acts of humanization, and which is all very, kind of passé 1950s humanism in so many ways, but it is a very different type of monumentality, and it brings us back to the 9 points and the idea of collaboration and synthesis between artists, architects, and all these things, but also the fact that architecture is chock full of art to perform something that lies outside of the purview of architecture. Even the non-denominational chapel that has an abstract painting instead of a kind of cult image somewhere in the General Assembly is a very striking relic of a very different idea of governance so I'm wondering if it's almost like I feel that, I don't know if this is your reading of Mumford or whether that was Mumford's reading of the UN. It feels like a very partial interpretation of the complex.
Mumford is basically silent on these questions, on the in a way, the synthesis of the arts inside the United Nations. When his architectural critique is purely architectural. Mumford uses objects to talk about other things. And so he's using the UN to talk about American capitalism on the world stage. He's using the skyscraper to talk about American power symbolically writ large around the world. So when it comes down to, let's say, the nitty-gritty of what's inside, he's completely silent about it in the architectural critique. He dislikes greatly the assembly building, formally, but also because it's completely overshadowed and it's used so rarely. Very interestingly, the things that you're describing, he writes about some years later, 1959, 1960, when he does an assessment of UNESCO. And in UNESCO, he very carefully walks us through, these kind of three wings, et cetera. And there's also there a split between the Secretariat and the Assembly. And what he concludes, he's brutal about those buildings too, by the way. He says these are just quite awful. What he says at the end is a very powerful statement. He writes 2 articles, and at the end of the second one, he says, when I was there, I was taken on tours through all the buildings, and I saw all this artwork, and I saw incredible installations about different cultures and the comity of people. And he says, but I had to do it on a tour. And couldn't UNESCO have spent all its money on simply introducing us to world culture, circling back to what Andrew's sort of suggesting might have happened in these kind of ethnographic villages in the 1939 fair? He said, shouldn't have that simply been the UNESCO mandate? Never to take us on tours by ticket, but to do it all the time. And so in that case, the kind of live aspect of culture is the one he's bemoaning. And the architecture critique gets us there. In the case of the UN, the architecture critique, it's much earlier, and it's really a moment at which Mumford is losing his utopianism very quickly and despairingly.
So I know we have a couple questions in the wings, but before we get to that, I wanted to abuse my moderator privilege for a second and follow up on that with a question for Conrad, actually. The kind of planning that Inderbir is describing that Mumford is conceptualizing and the kinds of organization that takes, in some ways we can trace it back to cities like Valletta that are planned in a kind of hyper-focused way if we're thinking about a city built ex novo where you're conceptualizing it as a kind of infrastructural whole. And I'm wondering, as you track the history of Malta chronologically, if you see Valletta kind of pushing against its planned nature?
From your talk, basically, the things that really emerged, that he had a very humane approach based on the community as well, that there's almost a quasi-yearning for a pre-industrial society. Mm-hmm. So I would imagine that a medieval kind of fabric would appeal more to him than a Renaissance. I mean, Renaissance fabric, there is always the dynamics of power. I don't know.
Totally.
I'm not an expert. So I would imagine, the informal, organic structure of something which is not preordained would have appealed to him. I don't think Valletta would be a right example, because Valletta is a military city, grid kind of. I don't know if you would concur with that. I mean, probably he would go for something that has evolved over time, fermented over time, rather than a preordained imposed plan.
Indeed.
Interesting. What Mumford loved about the Baroque city was the avenue, which oddly Valletta has.
The idea of,
but
I think he would prefer the village, like the picturesque rather, more human scale, more things which are more accidental, things where there isn't this dynamics of power of something which is imprinted there. Because obviously there's this great diffidence to the dynamics of power and the abuse of it, and that's.
Thank you. So I think Carl was our next question. If we could pass the microphone.
Thank you, most of you, for these great talks. It's very hard to talk after this brilliant presentation of the intellectual biography of Mumford. I came to read Mumford after I discovered for me Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of American Cities. And I think he's really one of the great public intellectuals in America. I have a question concerning his way of thinking. Listening to your brilliant presentation of his intellectual profile, I had the impression that he is very close to Herbert Marcuse, one-dimensional man. In a certain way, it's a fantastic description of the capitalist society, but on the other hand, it's in some way a closed view, very selective. And another parallel, I don't see so much the parallel to Spengler, but much more to Horkheimer and Adorno, in the sense that their critique of the instrumentelle Vernunft, the instrumental reason, it's quite close to Mumford's logic of technological development, etc. So my question is, why did he not perceive that in fact, the society is an open process. I mean, you mentioned the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, etc. He was, in a certain way, very strong critic, but to a certain degree, he did not perceive what's going on. And so I had the question, is it not a bit hermetic, his way of perceiving and thinking the world? Yes.
Maybe I'll just back up and start with I mean, it's a fascinating question. I'll start with Jane Jacobs. Mumford is incredibly unkind to Jane Jacobs. He completely dismisses the death and life of American cities. And yeah, that's right. And this is very interesting. Jane Jacobs, of course, is sort of upheld as this great kind of rabble-rouser, etc. But Mumford sees her as hopelessly sentimental and is clinging to something that is out of touch, out of date, and actually doesn't, and in fact, what Mumford fears in Jacobs is literally inertia. That Mumford never argues for inertia. He's incredibly cognizant that things must change, and he thinks cities must change. He's just concerned, how should they change? But in terms of change, you know, Jane Jacobs' book is what, 1960, 62, I think? 62, maybe? It also marks the period where Mumford somehow goes into meta-critique overdrive. And precisely as you say, as much as I can tell, he's sort of almost silent on the civil rights movement. It doesn't mean that he doesn't believe in it. He certainly obliquely mentions these kinds of things. But the kind of daily calamities of the United States in that period somehow pass him by. He seems to be completely consumed, like he's like plugged into the mega machine. The link to Marcuse, I think, is an interesting one. And actually, when I was talking, I just in a very oblique way mentioned, you know, Mumford's journalism never gave him the power of estrangement, of estranging things. And I was, in fact, quoting directly Adorno, Minima Moralia, and he sort of has this as one of his kind of epigraphic things. Last year, by complete coincidence, or a couple of years ago, I happened to read correspondence between Adorno and Marcuse. And Adorno is in Frankfurt, and Marcuse is in San Diego. And Adorno is, he calls the police into the institute when the students are protesting, and he has the institute closed. And Marcuse, meanwhile, after One-Dimensional Man, which Mumford would have surely understood, Marcuse, from my understanding, is, of course, much more on the side of the student radicals and this kind of eros and this kind of unleashing of libidinal energy and that sort of thing. And Adorno completely takes Marcuse to task on this. And they have, circa 68, a very unfriendly correspondence. And I've been thinking about Adorno a lot. I'm not an expert in this by any means, but since I was writing this paper, because to what degree, you know, it's a very interesting thing. Would you call Adorno a cultural pessimist in the 50s and 60s? Maybe. At the same time, he's desperately trying to find ways to understand the rebuilding of West German democracy through sociological, through the surveys, etc., propaganda survey, whatever. The two are very close, but it also seems to me exactly the moment that Mumford stops reading the Germans. You know, despite having all this kind of intellectual baggage, he can read it, etc. And very interestingly, in the 50s, he suddenly starts absorbing the French. And who does he absorb? Lévi-Strauss and Fernand Braudel. And he basically says, I've been saying this stuff all along, and here these guys are proving that I was right. That my view of longue durée history, my mechanisms of going back to the medieval to understand the modern, are being proven now by these French thinkers. And so I find, I'm just saying that actually apropos of nothing, but there is this kind of question of pessimism in Mumford, and I don't think he's a cultural pessimist, but I think he's somehow defeated. But still in Pentagon of Power, you have moments of where he's completely optimistic. He says we have to do things and blah, blah, blah. Mind you, it's the last book he writes in 1970. and 1990 is when he dies. If the audience is mine, I'm just going to quickly say one other thing. I have found it very fascinating that since I arrived at the Getty, the three people who told me that they were influenced by Mumford are Alexis Sakura, Carl, who just asked the question, and Hubertus Gassner. I find that absolutely fascinating that they're, and once I figured that out, I did a little bit of reading. There's this wonderful book on the German reception of Mumford in the 70s. And there's an incredible reception of Mumford in the German Greens. And there is something about maybe between two generations of Germans, Mumford suddenly gets translated in Germany in the 70s, all the books. And I think there's a reckoning post-68 in Germany vis-a-vis division between social democrats and the Greens and, of course, Red Army out there, that Mumford is going to allow the kind of questions that West Germans need understanding. And by the way, no American has mentioned the same thing, or Canadian or whatever. I find that absolutely fascinating.
So I think our next question is Morgan up in the back.
I also had a question for Inderbir, actually two interrelated questions that, in a sense, maybe would ask you to maybe cast some critical light onto Mumford. The first one has to do, if you could historicize Mumford a bit, how would you position him in relation to post-war suburban sprawl? And I don't think any of us would say that he would be in favor of Levittown or anything like that. But is he nonetheless somehow echoing, anticipating certain changes or patterns of development, even kind of anticipating new urbanism in a certain way, in its sort of like crass, commodified Mumford, and then the other kind of question is, if you could kind of disentangle a bit more the language of the organic. When you were talking about his antipathy to social movements, what I got was almost a kind of language of these social movements as malignant growths on the social body. And as you said, that he's not coming from necessarily a folkish angle, and yet nonetheless there's a politics to the language of the organic and what is natural and what deserves to be considered as such.
Maybe I'll answer the first question, then both of us can answer the second one, because I can't answer the second one. The first one, just simply on suburbanization, no, I don't think that Mumford by any means anticipates American suburbanization. I mean, he would have seen it as something ghastly, or much less the new urbanist movement. I don't think there's a kind of teleological determination that brings us from there to there. Suburbanization is a force that's, one could argue, is as homogenizing as any other. Mumford was searching for renewal. He was searching for something quite different. Maybe just by way to think about this, when I was reading Mumford, many, many years ago, I read Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. And in that, Jefferson, if I remember correctly, he talks about, if you go up the waterways of the United States, you arrive in small hamlets, small towns. This is one of his ideal sites of democracy. And then he describes these towns, and I've always was super moved by the fact that Jefferson says, and then at the center of every town is a school. And in a sense, Jefferson was replacing the church or the city hall. Mumford writes about Jefferson, and he says, Jefferson always said that there should be a continuous revolution in the United States. And he stands by that. But what's different about Mumford is he's resistant to the symbolism of something in a decentralized hamlet. His great example of American democracy is the New England Township, because people have fellowship in terms of self-governance, or an ideal of that. It's not about where they meet. And quite interestingly, the ideal plan of the Garden City has what I've always called an evacuated center. There's nothing in the middle. Unlike every late 19th century utopian literature that always put something at the center of her radial plan, Howard put nothing. And it was a space of public gathering. And the institutions start radiating out from that. Vis-a-vis organic, I'm not being able to think quick enough on my feet. It's a super, 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 super hard word for me. Not one I understand very well. I sort of get it through Mumford, but loads of other people. The best thing I could say about it would be, does the organic imply a fulfilling metabolic relation between cognition and production, between thinking about something and making it? And that would be a kind of way that Mumford, Frank Lloyd Wright, and many others would think about it. By the way, the other day I looked up the word organic in Raymond Williams's keywords, and Williams has two words in that book, nature and culture, which he says are the two hardest words in the English language. And I was surprised he didn't say that about organic. I didn't come out farther ahead after I read what he said. I was really, it's tough. Organic,
Oddly, organic has a lot, I think, in connotation-wise to do with authenticity, which is a theme that came up. If we're going back to that idea of the vernacular.
Even you could say the metabolists were also
right.
embraced it, and they were very high-tech. If you look at Kurakawa and Isozaki in the 60s, the Japanese metabolists, they were very much oriented towards the future as opposed to looking back.
Mm-hmm. Which I think brings us to the question of history, or the awareness of it. Brings us back to, I think, in some ways, your talk.
Yeah, because I think organic basically, again, I think it defines time boundaries. I mean, it's not a question of being modern or historicist or looking back forward. I think it's more possibly a model which tends to be more decentralized, more related to the kind of anthropomorphic form, the human relationship to the human body, and somehow again decentralized, But I think to try to put it in a time-controlled box, I think I personally would feel uncomfortable about that. I think it's way beyond.
I have a question for you. When you showed the slide of the parliament, I was struck by how small the assembly chamber is. Which I understand it's a small nation. So why in the world did Malta decide to build a parliament in 2009? Surely there was one before. What are the forces?
There was one which was in what was formerly the Grand Master's Palace, and then became the Governor's Palace. But it was the Armory Hall, which it was not a specifically designed parliament building or hall. It was just, how shall I say, an interior refurbishment of a historic building. And there was a big debate where the parliament should be. And I think the controversy was more why a parliament by its own nature is a high security building. So some people were saying, why spend all that money on building a building just at the entrance of the city, which should be something that would be more welcoming or used by all.
Right.
So that was one of the main crits, not as regards parliament or the design per se, but location. And some were making a case that it should have been located not at the entrance, but rather somewhere else. So that was one issue. Well, the site is not very, very, very large, but the other thing is Renzo Piano, when he talks about it, now probably more from an aesthetic or stylistic point of view, not from a functional point of view, he also compared it to literally a quarry. I mean, and when I've been inside the chamber once, and you do get the sense there that you're like, encased in stone within. But it is not a very big chamber. Yeah, you're right.
Because it seems incredibly heroic and monumental for an incredibly small.
Well, and there's another issue. I mean, it looks all stone. Well, initially he said, I want to build a building in Malta stone. And the stone was quarried in Gozo, but then sent to Spain to be laser cut because it was a very complicated form. It had this like sunscreen to it. Some what we're calling it the cheese grater. Kind of those who are, there are people who just don't accept modernity in Valletta. And for them, Valletta should not have a modern building. But in any case, so those were very complicated 3D laser cut stones, blocks that went to Spain and then came back, but originally from Gozo. But it's a cladding. The actual core of the building is steel. There's an exoskeleton of steel which is clad.
Right.
So again, is that a travesty or not? It's not a solid load-bearing building. Mm-hmm. You would not know because you wouldn't see it. But if you saw it when it was being constructed, you would realize that it was, being clad. So again, this question of is that dishonest or not? I mean, it appears to be to anyone who hasn't seen it being built.
And did the EU give money to build the Maltese Parliament?
I don't think so, because that is not considered, in a way, that's an institutional building.
Right.
The EU would give money if it's an infrastructural project like road improvements or highways or connectivity, that would not qualify for funding.
I see.
I think we probably have time for a final question for the panel before we open it up to any concluding thoughts. Did you have a question?
I think one quick thought about the organic is thinking about Ganguyan's writing about life, in which he talks about the organic and the machinic are actually dialectical, right? So it's not the opposite, but what do we model on? The organic could be the model of the machine could be inside the organic. So I feel that might be one way of thinking beyond the box. And so two very quick questions. One is, Mumford is so much behind our conference in thinking about the question of technology. And I was wondering, since he was reading the French in the 1950s, whether he ever comment on Simondon, which provide a kind of alternative mode of thinking about technology, right? For Mumford, I haven't read enough of Mumford, but I feel the human seems to be outside technology, and there's this kind of how should I say, a decline of thinking of technology from something that opens up for utopian possibilities to something that becomes ultra-threatening, right? So hence the notion of the mega machine. Whereas for Simondon, the notion of the technical object, the human are not outside the machine. So I wonder if that's one way to think about it. And another final question is to think about Mumford's mode of knowledge. So Mumford is the monument here somehow. So I wonder if there's any way of characterizing his mode of thinking and mode of knowledge.
I mean, vis-a-vis the French reference, I'm just simply not an expert enough to answer, did he have this reference? I haven't come across it. I mean, there maybe, but again, the examples that I mentioned were simply given not as new intellectual influences, but simply to say, aha, these guys are proving what I've been doing all along. Mumford's intellectual formation is sort of done, I think, by 1939. He's already 44 years old by that point. He's, formed his kind of notion, whatever that notion is vis-a-vis cyclical history, and he's formed his idea about the redemptive power of technology. No one in this room should go away thinking that Mumford hated technology. He saw technology as fundamentally liberating. It was just a question of in what terms. So vis-a-vis a French source, if you think of Jacques Ellul and technological society, that has some correspondence with Mega Machine. But Mumford might have been wary of that because that's sort of saying we're all going to hell in a handbasket, even if the same principles of the bureaucratization of the world appear in both Ellul and Mumford. But Mumford's model of thinking, which you could say is a model of technological thinking, also exists, and he's not doing this self-consciously, although, I mean, it's not his raison d'etre is what I mean. It exists in tension to Marx. Technics and Civilization is a response to Marx's Capital in many ways. Mumford will never say this, but in letters and other kinds of things, he's completely grappling with Marx and how Marx described capital. Mumford is very complementary to Marx in many ways, but he is absolutely not a Marxist, and he's not on board with Marx's conclusions. If you can sort of think about the way Marx and Engels slightly are complementary and then dismissive to utopian socialists in the manifesto, that's kind of how Mumford thinks about Marx. He says, Marx gave us great ideas of analysis, but his conclusions are really problematic. And the reason that is for Marx vis-a-vis technology, or let's say the machine, is because for him, the end point of Marx is to rebuild the state. And Mumford thinks that's really, really a bad idea. That the state, that literally the machine, the machinic apparatus of the state, the fulfillment of capital, is very, very frightening. And what Mumford wants is regionalism, decentralization, the machine in control of people. Another way to describe it would be simply to read Frank Lloyd Wright's essay, The Art and Craft of the Machine of whatever, 1910, Willie Morris, all of these kinds of guys. He's absolutely Ruskinian. And Mumford's notion of culture is being recuperated directly from British sources in the 19th century, German as well. But the recuperation of culture in the 19th century is not a Tory version of culture. It's not an Arnoldian version of culture. It's a radical notion of culture that is interpreted from Ruskin. And that has technology and the organic, let's say, embedded in it, but it's not the driver. And so this is where Mumford is, frankly, very intoxicating, but also really bewildering for me. You got to read a lot to get a bit, and it sort of goes on and on and on. But I have to confess that on a very, very personal note, these months of dealing with Mumford, someone I always knew I wanted to understand more. When I read Technics and Civilization in grad school 15 years ago, I happened to also read Marx's Capital. One I read on my own, the other I was taught. And those two books shaped my life, like the way I think about things. And returning to Mumford now, I have to say it's been very, very personal, vis-a-vis my own politics of the world. It's really reoriented how I think about stuff. So there's that.
I think that's a very nice place to end. Thank you to our two speakers this evening. I think Alexa's just going to make a comment about what comes next. Stay tuned.
First of all, thank you all, the presenters and the moderators, for another very rich and interesting, multifaceted approaches to monumentality. I do know that we won't be able to solve the terms, the different approaches in this one conference or in this scholar year, but I learned so much so far from all the people who were here before, from everybody in the symposium, and I do know we have still a couple of more presentations for the next couple of weeks. And I think what I'm going to walk away with is the different lenses, the multifaceted cultural notions that we were exposed to, the different kind of cycles, the temporalities of what we might consider monumentality. It's also, I think, very, very personal at the end. And we learned that also with Louis Mumford, who tried to grapple with his explanation of, I would call it, monumental changes in his life and in his time. Because when Inderbir also mentioned the death of his son, and I did read part of that book, and I have to say that it is so personal, and it's also very, very monumental in many different ways, and also to try to grapple with the different kind of changes in society and technical approaches. That's quite substantial. So I want to stop there, but when you said I was touched by it, I was deeply touched, like many others, my generation and the generation before, who were really kind of, I wouldn't call it brainwashed, but if you didn't read Mumford, something was missing in your education in the German-speaking world. It was quite interesting. But enough of Mumford now. What I wanted to say is we're now walking over to the private dining room. There will be a reception, and anybody who wants to come and bring others they find on the way, please do so. And then we are from there going all together or, in smaller groups to the Harold Williams Auditorium, where we have our very final element of Monumentality, and that will be a film screening and then a conversation with Andrew Perchuk between Andrew and Siasta Gates about his latest film, which is a monument to a different event here in the United States. You'll see more about it later. Okay, so thank you all very much.